Hello my lovies and welcome to Divination Death Witch. I'm Rain and today we are talking about ghosts and cemeteries as well as the types of spirits you may encounter in a graveyard or cemetery. This is actually a topic I had planned to talk about a while back, sometime around the summer-ish of 2024, but I kept getting delayed. Apparently it just wasn't the right time. But now that I am breathing sort of a second wind into the YouTube channel, I just felt like this was the time to do this particular episode. I'm really excited about it because cemeteries and graveyards are a pretty important topic to me. They are important places to me personally, and they are a big part of my practice as a death witch. I've already done a video about my accepting the label of Death Witch, that technically I've always been one, but I've come to embrace this contemporary label. I'll link that video in the description box below. I've also done a video titled What Does the Death Witch Do?, which I will also link below so that you can learn about what death witchcraft often entails if you are curious. Since I have plans to do some Death Witch cemetery content on the channel in the future, I thought it would be a good idea for me to explain a little about spirits and cemeteries and what types of spirits you are and aren't likely to find in a cemetery or graveyard. I'm sure you've seen shows featuring ghost hunting and paranormal investigation groups exploring cemeteries at night or heard stories of reportedly haunted cemeteries. So what's the real deal? Are cemeteries really haunted as often as the media would have us believe? There are an estimated 10,500 cemeteries here in America, according to what are referred to as death care industry experts. From what I've been able to ascertain, these numbers only account for cemeteries that are owned and operated by private companies, nonprofit organizations such as cemetery associations, local governments, or churches. I don't pretend to know what the cemetery situation across the country is, but I know that in Pennsylvania, where I'm originally from, and in Ohio, there are a lot of very old cemeteries that aren't owned or operated by any of the groups listed. And I'm not sure what the technical state of the deeds to the land they are on is. You can drive through the countryside and come across random small cemetery plots that were usually small family plots. The families died out or left the area long ago, and often there were no heirs that could be found, or the land they were left on was left abandoned. No one cares for these small abandoned cemeteries, at least no official body. Sometimes the local historical societies or residents will try to do what they can. I'm really doubting that these cemeteries are being counted in the estimated 10,500 American cemeteries. What does this have to do with whether or not cemeteries are haunted? Well, given the number of cemeteries in the U.S., the statistical probability that at least a few of them are haunted is pretty good. That said, it has been my experience and the experience of many other mediums and sensitives that as a general rule, cemeteries are not usually what we would technically call haunted places. As a side note, there are about 22,000 funeral homes, and no, as a general rule, they aren't usually haunted either. However, they do tend to have spirit activity. I'll explain as we go on what the difference is between a place being haunted and a place having a tendency towards spirit activity, because I understand how a lot of you might be asking, isn't that the same thing? Now, I know that you're here because you want to know about and hear about the types of spirits that you're likely to encounter in a cemetery, but it's going to take me a few minutes to get to that because we do need to cover some other ground first. No pun intended. I sort of became fascinated with cemeteries in my early 20s, and I started to pick up photography at that time as well. It was the peace I found in them and also the history. While I find most cemeteries peaceful, I'm particularly fond of older cemeteries and how they are connected to an area's history. it's safe to say I've probably visited more cemeteries than the average person. My husband thought my fascination with cemeteries was a little weird during the early years of our time together. All these years later, he never passes a cemetery that I haven't been to yet without pointing it out, and he willingly takes me on what we call cemetery crawls. Sometimes he even gets excited about the history and headstones we find. While I do have a much better filter to keep out unwanted spirit communication these days, as opposed to when I was a child visiting cemeteries, I have always enjoyed the peace and emptiness I find in most cemeteries. As we dive into this topic, let me give you a sort of operating definition of what a haunting is. Not everyone agrees, but this is what I'd say is a pretty generally acceptable definition. Overall, a haunting is the reoccurring presence of a spirit in a place that reoccurs over an extended period of time, and this reoccurring presence over an extended period of time is not part of the natural function of that type of spirit, or it is a non-human malevolent spirit that is the reoccurring presence over the extended period of time. Which is a fancy way of saying a haunting is either an earthbound spirit, also known as the restless dead, that keeps showing up for an extended period of time, or it's a baneful spirit that was never human and keeps showing up at a place, and they usually wreak some type of havoc. The malevolent spirit, I mean. Earthbound spirits may or may not wreak havoc. Departed loved ones dropping in for a visit don't constitute a haunting. It is only a haunting if your departed loved one has not crossed over and is remaining on our plane of existence as an earthbound spirit. Spirit guides, ancestors, nature spirits, the fae, and various other types of spirits don't count as a haunting either. Departed loved ones may be with us frequently over an extended period of time, but that is a different kind of spirit communication and contact, and it isn't a haunting. I want to try to make where I stand on my operating definition clear because I say that cemeteries as a general rule aren't haunted, but that doesn't mean you won't encounter spirits in them. This operating definition of the term haunting is also why funeral homes aren't, as a general rule, haunted either, even if they do tend to have spirit activity. I've found that spirits usually wait to cross over until after their viewing at the funeral home or after their burial. I've heard some psychics and mediums say that spirits cross over within 72 hours after their funeral. I don't know that I'd put an exact amount of hours on it, but that's in the ballpark in my personal experience working with spirits. I've been to more than my share of viewings, and many times the spirit of the departed person is there, at least part of the time during the viewing. But they do cross over after and don't continue to hang out around the funeral home. Funeral homes aren't haunted by our operating definition because these aren't earthbound spirits who keep a presence there over an extended period of time. They are basically just popping in for a short time while they are in transition. Why aren't cemeteries haunted as a general rule when there are so many dead people in them? Well, most of us cross over when we pass. Those who remain here as earthbound spirits typically attach themselves to a place that was either important in their lives or the place where their actual death occurred. They don't tend to stick around where their body is laid to rest because the cemetery wasn't a part of their life or an important place to them, so they don't attach themselves to their place of burial. When you think about it, it really does make more sense for the restless dead to haunt their old house, the place of their death, or something like that, and that is what we see much more frequently. There are reported cases, though, of earthbound or malevolent spirits attached to a cemetery every so often. One of the reasons commonly given for earthbound spirits or the restless dead to haunt the place of their burial is when someone has been improperly buried. It's important to note that improperly buried is a relative term, and in this case, it's the deceased who gets to decide if they were properly laid to rest or not. It was actually a visit to a Harmonite cemetery that brought this lesson into focus for me, but that's another story. I've heard the argument made, if someone's dead, what do they care how their body was buried? Listen, I don't have all the answers, but I can tell you that some spirits do very much care about this. I'm just going to give you a quick example, and I don't know that I'd call this a haunting, because when these people died, they did cross over, but their spirits did make their presence and ire known, and likely are still doing so to this day. One of the places I lived was in Mercer County, Pennsylvania, near the Shenango Lake. Those from that area know that this is not a natural lake. This area was once inhabited with schools, churches, stores, cemeteries, etc. But the county needed to build a dam to help the city of Sharon stop flooding. I don't remember what year the Army Corps of Engineers built the dam. It had to have been the 60s or later, because my male parental unit, who was born in 1950, can remember the time prior to the dam when the city of Sharon would flood frequently. But in building this dam, they used eminent domain to clear the people from the section of land that would become the Shenango Lake, and then they just flooded it. At the bottom of the lake, there are still all of the buildings and everything that used to be there. Well, when they were getting ready to flood this area, they paid a company to move the bodies from the cemetery to a new cemetery very close by, but would be out of the flood zone. This is so cliche that I'm sure you can guess where this is going. That company did not, in fact, move and rebury the bodies. Even though there are headstones for all of those people in the new cemetery, they didn't move the bodies, just the headstones. Whenever there's a really heavy rain or the water level has been up, and then the Army Corps of Engineers intentionally lowers the water level, it is not uncommon for folks to come across human remains on the shores of the area near where the cemetery was. I don't think I'd say the spirits of these people haunt the area, but they can make their displeasure known about how their remains were treated. In places like Gettysburg, though, on Cemetery Hill, the question becomes, is the cemetery haunted by intelligent earthbound spirits, or are the reports of hauntings there really what we would call imprints and not actually a haunting? As I look at stories of reportedly haunted cemeteries around the United States, I find that most of the reports are just urban legends and not hauntings at all. Still, there are a couple that sound like they may have legitimate hauntings, and I'd love to go and investigate these someday. I've had many spirit experiences at cemeteries, but I'd say only 1 or 2 of those were actual hauntings. It's true that a spirit attaching itself to its place of burial is pretty rare under normal circumstances, but I get asked questions like, well, I go to my loved one's grave a lot to talk to them. Does that mean they don't hear me if the cemeteries aren't haunted? The restless dead are not likely hanging out at their places of burial, and technically neither is your departed loved one who has crossed over. But your departed loved one can hear you. And here's why. Your departed loved one who has crossed over can hear you no matter where you are when you talk to them. But I've met many folks over the years who benefit from going to their departed loved one's grave in order to talk to them. For these folks, the gravesite becomes a sort of psychic or psychological trigger, some would even say. They can make a stronger connection with the spirit they wish to communicate with by going to that spot, and may even feel like they are more likely to receive a sign in response if they go to the place of burial to communicate. Even I, and I'm a medium, when I lived close to my sister's grave, while I can talk to her anywhere, I would go and sit by her grave and just chat with her. The people I've come across who feel that they make the best connection at the loved one's gravesite often, but not always, tend to believe that they have no real gift or ability to communicate with their departed loved one in any other way. This isn't always the case, but it is a common thread I've noticed. They see the geography of their day-to-day places kind of like dead zones for cell phones. The best analogy I can give is this. They seem to feel or express that they feel that in their daily grind, they get no bars, and they've got to get close to the cell tower, gravesite in this case, to get a call to connect to their departed loved one. The spirit isn't actually attached to the burial site, but it functions as a way for the living person to get more bars, to make their signal stronger, and get their call to go through. Again, a departed loved one responding to someone talking to them at their place of burial doesn't constitute a haunting, but it is a very valid form of spirit communication. So while your great-grandma doesn't generally hang out at her gravesite, if you go there and talk to her, she will most likely drop by to hear what you have to say. When it comes to cemeteries being haunted, the bottom line is most tales of haunted cemeteries are urban legends more than anything else, like the Screaming Skull in Baltimore at the Westminster Cemetery where Edgar Allan Poe is buried. But that doesn't mean there aren't spirits present or spirits that you can call in to connect with there, even though they aren't haunting the place. I really feel like my usual listeners don't need this pointed out, but I'm going to say this anyway. When visiting cemeteries or any location that you are investigating or want to work with, even not as part of any sort of official group, you should always treat these places with respect. You should never leave litter, graffiti anything, or cause any sort of property damage, and you should always treat both the living and the dead with respect. I know that a vast majority of my listeners already understand that, but if you are new to listening to me or paranormal investigation or death, witchcraft, etc., I don't want to take for granted that you already know that. Cemeteries and a lot of places that we investigate for paranormal activity or work at as death witches have historical significance. The spirits and the history of the place both deserve respect no matter your opinions on them. Alright, now that we've cleared up the idea that cemeteries are notoriously haunted, let's talk about what you're really here to get into, which is the types of spirits you are likely to find in a cemetery. Just a quick note here, I've been using the word cemetery throughout this episode. The same goes for graveyards. If you don't know the difference between the two, graveyards are attached to a church and cemeteries are not. The first type of spirit that we're going to look at is the spirit of the cemetery itself. This one isn't really a spirit per se, it's more of a genus loci, which is the energy or the vibe of the place. I am considering doing a future episode on the many soul theory. If I do, then we'll talk about how the bone soul fits into the spirit of the cemetery in that video. If that is a theory you already subscribe to or may wish to explore, let me know and we'll look at maybe doing that video in the future. Each cemetery has its own spirit, vibe, energy, and while you won't work with it like you would work with an intelligent and active spirit, it can influence your experiences in the cemetery and workings if you conduct any there, or ethically harvest anything to use in your workings from there. Remember, respect is always key, and we don't take anything from a space that the spirits haven't given us permission to take. The second type of spirit is the guardian of the cemetery. There are some different theories about who or what this spirit is, and to be honest, I feel like the guardian of the cemetery can be different things in different cemeteries. Let's look at their function first, which is to keep what's in the cemetery safe from the living, and in some cases to keep the living safe from what's in the cemetery, or to keep what is supposed to be in the cemetery where it belongs. While cemeteries aren't haunted as a general rule, it does and can happen. In these cases, the guardian of the cemetery can be there just as much to protect us from the spirits as the spirits and cemetery from us. They can also be deterrents to any spirits that might want to haunt a cemetery and likely contribute to why most cemeteries aren't haunted as we defined earlier in the episode. So, who are the guardians of the cemetery? There are some who say that these are guardian spirits who were never human, and their whole purpose is to guard the dead from the ill-intentioned living and the other way around when necessary. In some cemeteries, you'll find a monument that has a lion, angel, or soldier that instead of having their face turned down in mourning, they're looking straight ahead. And these monuments have a spirit or contain a spirit that functions as the guardian of the cemetery. There are some other types of statues I've seen mentioned as well, but these are the most common that you will see mentioned. Lastly, this is the one I find most fascinating. That the guardian of the cemetery is the soul of the first person who was buried there. This spirit is not one of the restless dead. They aren't haunting the cemetery. It's just the site of their spirit job, if you will. You have entered their workspace, their office. To be honest, I don't feel the guardian of the cemetery is just one type of spirit. I find that it can be any of these and sometimes a combination of these. When you go to a cemetery for the first time, it's a good idea to introduce yourself to the guardian of the cemetery, or guardians as the case may be. Say hi, tell them why you are there, show them gratitude, and show them that you will treat them and all of the spirits within the grounds with respect and dignity. If you've been visiting a cemetery for a while and haven't done this, it's never too late. So be sure to do this on your next visit. Many practitioners leave an offering for the guardian of the cemetery, especially near the cemetery gate or entrance. I do highly encourage this, but check the cemetery's rules before leaving any physical items. I've encountered an increasing number of cemeteries that do not allow any physical items to be left behind at the cemetery. Because of this, since I am a Reiki, my offering typically takes the form of offering healing energy to the guardian of the cemetery and all other spirits as well as to the land. But I do also leave physical offerings when it is permitted and I feel it is appropriate. I have, on occasions, lit candles or burned incense while visiting as an offering, making sure to take everything with me when I go. But again, make sure that's okay to do in the cemetery you are visiting. While I haven't seen a cemetery list rules that expressly state that I can't burn a candle or incense while I am there and leave nothing behind, during the dry season when I was living in Washington State, I could still likely have gotten in trouble for it. So, follow the posted rules and use your best discretion and common sense for everything else. Just as an interesting sort of side note while we were discussing this type of spirit, last year I heard another death witch talking about the guardians of the cemetery, and she said that they always treat her with suspicion until they get to know her. If you feel like you are being watched in a cemetery, there's a good chance it's a guardian of the cemetery watching what you're doing. That doesn't always mean they are treating you with suspicion, they're just doing their job. Her experience is her own and 100% valid. I just want to make that clear. I am not saying she is wrong in any way, shape, or form. And while I have been aware of guardians of the cemetery watching me, they don't usually make me feel like they are suspicious of me. Keep in mind, this is all UPG, based on my own experience, and again, yes, this is UPG. The times where I've felt what she described have been in cemeteries where a lot of shenanigans and dumb fuckery have gone on. So it makes sense that the guardians of those cemeteries would be on high alert and be inclined to view all of the living as sus. Maybe they weren't finding her sus so much as they've had to deal with so much BS from the living that they just give everyone who comes to that cemetery the bombastic side eye. But I wanted to point this out because if you feel like you have gone into a cemetery or graveyard and the guardian of the space is making you feel like they are viewing you in a way that they think you're sus, you want to take a step back and get to the root of why they feel you are sus. Is it just that this particular cemetery has experienced a lot of disrespect, vandalism, and things like that, and so the guardian or guardians of this space are just on high alert and treat all the living as if they are sus? Or are you doing something to deserve their suspicion of you? Even if you're doing it unintentionally. After you've taken that step back and you've determined that you're not actually doing anything sus, or your intentions aren't sus, but you still feel like the guardian of the cemetery is keeping a close eye on you, make sure that you have introduced yourself. Make sure that you leave offerings, and most importantly, show through your actions that you are going to treat all beings and the land with dignity and respect, and that you will not take anything from the place without permission. And if you are wanting allies from that cemetery to join your spirit team or assist you in workings, don't rush it. Be sure to build a relationship first before asking for anything. Take things slow and forge healthy, trusting relationships with the spirit there first, including any and all guardians, before you even consider asking if they are willing to work with you. Our third spirit type are the spirits of the dead. There are actually a few different types of spirits of the dead that you can connect with and work with in a cemetery. If you have a departed loved one who's buried there, you can work with them in that space. Blood ancestors are another option, meaning those who were genetically related to you. Maybe you happen to have an affinity ancestor that is buried close to you. I mentioned Poe earlier, so if you're a writer, maybe he's one of your affinity ancestors and you could visit his resting place to work with him. There are also ancestors of place. Now, this one can be confusing because different people who write about ancestral work can have very different definitions of what an ancestor of place is. When I say ancestors of place, I mean people who are connected to that geographic region because they lived and died there. So let me break it down for you in terms of some cemeteries and how they relate to me and the types of the dead that you may find and work with in cemeteries. There is a cemetery back in Pennsylvania where my sister is buried. She'd be a departed loved one for me. Those of you who have been around my content for a while know that I make a distinction in my work between departed loved ones and ancestors. My great-grandfather, who died before I was born, is also buried there. He would be my blood ancestor. The difference for me between the two is one was alive when I was alive and I had contact with. The other one died before I was born and I never actually had contact with them in this lifetime. In this case, I mean living contact. When I lived in Washington State, I was fortunate enough to live just down the road from a cemetery where one of my affinity ancestors was buried. Rebecca Carr was a very famous spiritualist medium in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and her place of burial happened to be just up the road from me. I was very fortunate in that I could just hop up the road and visit that absolutely amazing Victorian cemetery and get to communicate and work with her as one of my affinity ancestors. Many of you know that I moved from Pennsylvania to Western Washington, and now I've moved to Louisiana, which means I don't have a connection to the land here, but as a death witch, forming a connection to the land where I am is important. I'm building one, and to help me with that, I can connect with the spirits of the dead in the local cemeteries as ancestors of place to help me develop a connection to this land, the land of my new home, with their consent and permission, of course. This is what I mean by working with ancestors of place. Some other spirits of the dead that you could connect with or work with at a cemetery are the mighty dead or the forgotten dead. We can cover those in another video. If you're interested, let me know in the comments below. The fourth type of spirit are nature spirits. Most cemeteries include nature, which means there are nature spirits present. Most practitioners find that nature and the nature spirits present in a cemetery have a slightly different flavor than their non-cemetery counterparts, but you can work with them in similar ways. So, for example, rosemary might have a certain energy or vibe or be great for certain type of workings if you grow it in your garden, but you may find that it has a different air about it and works best in slightly different workings if you harvest it from a cemetery. Just make sure you are doing all the things you should be doing when working with any kind of nature spirits. You know, the basics: respect, consent, offerings, gratitude, all the usual suspects. The fifth type of spirit that you might encounter in the cemetery is death, capital D. Some practitioners see and work with death as a full-fledged entity. I tend to see death as something more along the lines of an egregore. So a little closer to being an entity than the spirit of the cemetery, but not the same as the spirits of the dead or a deity. It's kind of hard to explain this concept, to find good words to describe it. But if you work with death, or the spirit of death, if you will, you can connect with them at a cemetery. You don't usually find them just hanging out there. You do tend to have to call on them to get them to be present. But it's very easy to connect with the spirit of death, or death capital D, in a cemetery. Why might one want to work with death capital D? There are a lot of reasons. It could be that you need to bring an ending, or you need help going through a transition, that you need help going through a transformation, that you are grieving, and it could be part of your process of expressing and processing your grief. There are a myriad of reasons that a death witch, or even someone who isn't a death witch, might want to go to the cemetery and communicate with death as an entity or an egregore. The sixth and final type of spirit, if you will, that we're going to talk about is death deities. Now, some people would say that they wouldn't put this in the category because they don't consider deities, or deities, however you prefer to say it, spirits. They consider them something else, something above, something different. I consider deities to be spirits as well, a type of spirit. And for that reason, we're going to discuss them briefly here. I've never walked into a cemetery and been like, oh hey, there's Hades, or Hecate, or Persephone, or Hell, etc. Just chillin', hanging out. Don't get me wrong, I think it would be freaking awesome if it ever happened. I just haven't had that happen yet. But like working with death, or the spirit of death, the cemetery is a place where you can usually call on and connect with death deities if you are a deist. I happen to be one, but you don't have to be a deist, and you don't have to work with death deities if you are a death witch or do any kind of spirit work. But if you do work with any of the death deities, then going to the cemetery and connecting with them there can be a very powerful experience. If you are just starting out in your journey with a specific death deity and you're in that early stage of the relationship where you're getting to know them, they're getting to know you, and all of that, going to the cemetery and just connecting with them, chilling with them, vibing with them, maybe doing a little ritual or leaving a little offering for them can be a very powerful experience and a very enjoyable experience. But as always, take what resonates with you and leave the rest behind. Those are the 6 types of spirits that you are most likely to encounter in a cemetery or a graveyard per my experience, study, and my conversations with other mediums. This is by no means an exhaustive list. I'm sure there are cases, incidences, or special circumstances where other types of spirits may be lingering around a cemetery or graveyard. These are just what I find to be the most common. I hope that you've enjoyed our chat today about cemetery spirits. If you have, please give the video a thumbs up. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments what your experiences have been with spirits and cemeteries. Don't forget to check out our Patreon. The link is in the description box below. And until I see you again, as always, my lovelies, blessings to you wherever your journey finds you.